I was standing at the edge of my husband's grave, and I didn't want to leave. The November wind was cutting through my black coat, carrying the smell of fresh earth and dying leaves, and I just stood there, staring at the mahogany casket being lowered into the ground. Everyone else had already gone. My daughter Ashley had barely hugged me before she was walking toward the parking lot with her husband Derek, her heels clicking against the path with a kind of urgency that felt wrong for a funeral. My son Brandon had squeezed my shoulder, just once, like a formality, and then he was gone too, sliding into his black BMW without looking back. My sister-in-law Donna had tried to stay with me. She had grabbed my hand and whispered, "Brittany, honey, you don't have to do this alone." But I had told her to go. I needed this moment. I needed to say goodbye to Richard in the only way I knew how. Quietly, completely, without an audience. "I know what's coming," I whispered to the casket. My voice was steady, which surprised me. I had expected to break. But something in me had already shifted. Something cold and calm had settled into my chest over the past 3 days, ever since I had found the envelope tucked inside Richard's old leather Bible, the one he kept in the nightstand drawer. The one none of our children would ever think to look in. I pressed my gloved hand to the cold brass rail above the grave. "You prepared me for this. I didn't want to believe it, but you prepared me." The cemetery workers were waiting at a respectful distance, shovels in hand, patient and quiet. I gave Richard one last look, the place in the earth that was now his. And then I turned and walked toward the parking lot, where my silver Lexus sat alone under a row of bare oak trees. Inside the trunk, along with my black overnight bag and a small box of tissues, was a soft-sided carry-on suitcase. And inside that suitcase, folded carefully inside a zippered inner pocket that I had triple-checked before leaving the house that morning, was a document that Richard had signed 18 months ago. A document that changed everything. But let me go back to the beginning, because you need to understand who Richard and I were before you can understand what our children did, and why it nearly destroyed me, and why, in the end, it destroyed them instead. I met Richard Calloway in the fall of 1994. I was 23 years old, fresh out of Ohio State with a degree in accounting, working my first real job at a mid-sized firm in Columbus. Richard was 31, already running his own small landscaping and property management company that he had built from scratch over 8 years of early mornings and late nights, and every kind of weather Ohio could throw at him. He wasn't flashy. He drove a beat-up Ford pickup with a cracked dashboard and a Pine air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror, and he wore work boots to restaurants sometimes because he forgot to change, and he had calloused hands and a laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest and made everyone in the room turn around whether they meant to or not. I wasn't looking for anyone. I was focused on my career, on paying off my student loans, on building a life that felt solid and entirely mine. My own childhood had not been particularly stable. My parents had divorced when I was 9, loudly and badly, the kind of divorce that left marks on everyone involved. Money had always been tight in both households afterward. My mother working double shifts at the hospital where she was a nurse. My father's child support arriving late more often than not. I grew up understanding at a cellular level that security was something you built yourself, carefully and deliberately, because no one was going to hand it to you, and the people you counted on most could disappear in ways you didn't anticipate. That understanding shaped everything about how I moved through the world. It was why I had chosen accounting. It was why I worked the way I worked. Thorough, detailed, always 3 steps ahead on every number. So, when Richard Calloway walked into the accounting firm where I worked, needing someone to help him restructure his business finances, his company had grown faster than his bookkeeping could keep up with, and the tax situation had become genuinely complicated. I was professional and thorough, and I did not notice at first how often he found reasons to come back for follow-up meetings. There was always a question, always a document he needed to discuss, always a reason to sit down across from me at the conference table with the bad fluorescent lighting and go through numbers that, if I am being honest, could have been addressed in a phone call. My colleague Dana noticed before I did. She had been at the firm for 12 years, and she had seen every variety of client behavior, and she was not easily impressed by any of it. "That man is not here about his accounts receivable," she told me one Wednesday afternoon, watching Richard walk out of the conference room and through the glass lobby doors to where his battered pickup was parked at the meter. "He barely looked at the spreadsheets. He looked at you the entire time." I told her she was imagining things. She gave me the look she reserved for particularly naive statements and went back to her desk. She was right, as she nearly always was. 3 months after our first meeting, Richard called me, not the office main line, my direct line, which meant he had written it down somewhere, and asked if I would have dinner with him. His voice on the phone was different from his voice in the conference room, slightly less certain. I found that endearing in a way I hadn't expected. I said yes. Our first dinner was at an Italian place in the short north that neither of us had been to before, chosen by process of elimination when his first suggestion turned out to be closed on Mondays, and my suggestion had a 2-hour wait. We sat at a corner table under a trellis with fake vines on it, and we talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with balance sheets or tax liability. And at the end of the evening, he walked me to my car and shook my hand. Actually, shook my hand, formal and slightly awkward, and said it had been a pleasure, and he hoped we could do it again. I drove home smiling at the steering wheel. I was not expecting that. I had not been expecting any of it. 6 months after the first dinner, Richard drove me out to the Hocking Hills on a Sunday morning in October. The truck still had the cracked dashboard, but he had put in new seat covers, and walked with me along the Old Man's Cave trail through the gorge. And when we stopped on a sandstone ledge with the sound of a waterfall coming up from below, and the October trees blazing red and gold on both sides, he said, without any particular preamble, that he would like very much to marry me if I was willing, and that he understood if I needed time to think about it, but that he had been thinking about it for about 4 months now, and he didn't see any reason to wait longer to ask. I looked at him, standing there on that ledge with the autumn light coming through the trees, in a gray fleece and his good hiking boots. No ring, because he had decided to ask first and get the ring afterward, because he wanted me to choose it with him. And I thought about my parents' divorce and the tight money and the way I had built everything so carefully and alone, and I thought, this is not the kind of thing I can plan my way into or out of. Some things you just know. I said yes without needing time to think about it. We got married in June of 1996 in a small ceremony at a garden venue outside Columbus, a restored farmhouse with a rose arbor and stone paths between the tables. 60 people. White roses, because I have always loved white roses. And Richard showed up 40 minutes before the ceremony to check that they had used the right variety, because he had read about the order 3 times and wanted to make sure. My mother cried from the moment she arrived until well into the reception. My father sat on his side of the room and behaved himself, which was the most I had asked of him. Richard's mother, Gloria, a formidable, clear-eyed woman from Zanesville, who had raised Richard and his sister Donna largely on her own after Richard's father left when they were young, and who had built a life of such fierce and practical dignity that she had become, over the years, a kind of lodestone for everyone around her, held my hands in the room where I was getting ready, both of her strong, warm hands around both of mine, and looked at me with an expression that was somewhere between joy and relief, and said, "You are exactly what this family needed." I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time. Later, much later, I would. Our life together was good, not perfect. Nothing built by 2 actual human beings is ever perfect, but genuinely, substantively, day in and day out good in the way that matters most. The kind of good that accumulates over time rather than arriving in dramatic moments. Richard's company grew steadily through the late 90s and early 2000s. He added a construction division in 1999, the year Ashley was born, working at the kitchen table after she was asleep to finalize the contracts. eating cold leftovers at 10 at night because he had been out at a job site until 8. He added the commercial property maintenance arm in 2003, when Brandon was 2 and Ashley was starting kindergarten. Then, his proudest achievement, the thing he talked about the way some men talk about sports teams or trophies, the rental property portfolio, which he began assembling in 2005 with a duplex on Bryden Road that he bought for $62,000, repaired himself over 6 weekends, and rented out for rates that his accountant told him were on the conservative side. And Richard said he'd rather have tenants who could actually pay him than maximum profit that nobody saw. By the time our children were in middle school, we were comfortable. More than comfortable. We were the kind of financially stable that felt almost bewildering to me sometimes, coming from where I had come from. We had a 4-bedroom colonial in Upper Arlington, one of Columbus's most desirable neighborhoods, on a street of mature trees and well-maintained houses, where people knew their neighbors and shoveled each other's walks. The yard was Richard's particular pride. He had landscaped it himself over 2 summers into something that made the neighbors slow down when they drove past. A rolling front lawn with hydrangea beds and a Japanese maple that turned the color of a fire in October. We had 2 good cars, a vacation cabin in the Hocking Hills at a place not far from where he had proposed, which felt right in a way that was hard to articulate, a college savings account for each child that we had started when they were infants, and that had grown, by the time they were teenagers, into something solid. The kind of financial cushion that let you sleep at night, not because nothing could ever go wrong, but because you knew that if something did, you could absorb it. I had left the accounting firm in 2001. Ashley was 2. The firm had offered me partner track, but the timing was wrong, and Richard needed someone who understood the numbers as well as he did to help manage what the business was becoming. What I thought would be a temporary arrangement became my second career. I handled the books, the contracts, the tax strategy, the banking relationships, the insurance renewals, the lease agreements for the rental properties, the financial reporting to the bank that had been our primary lender since the beginning. I knew every number in the business the way I knew the layout of our kitchen, completely without having to look. Richard built things and managed people and found opportunities. I made sure the financial architecture of it all was sound. We worked side by side for over 2 decades in a partnership that was so thoroughly integrated that sometimes our accountant Phil joked he couldn't tell where one of us ended and the other began on the spreadsheets. In all that time, in all the stress of payroll and contractor disputes and the 2008 crash, which hit the construction division hard enough that we had to let 3 people go and take no salaries for 4 months while we stabilized, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table at 11 at night, running scenarios, figuring out what could be sold and what had to be held. In all of it, I never once doubted that we were partners, equal partners, in every sense of the word. The money we had was ours. The decisions were ours. The sleepless nights and the good years and the hard years, and the cabin in the hills where we went every October to remember who we were, all of ours. Our children, Ashley, born in September of 1998, and Brandon, born in March of 2001, grew up in the middle of all of this. They grew up watching their father build something from hard work, and their mother hold it together with precision and care. They watched us argue over business decisions sometimes, heard us up late going over numbers, saw what sustained effort over decades actually looked like from the inside. They went to Upper Arlington schools, which were excellent, and participated in the activities we encouraged, and a few we did not particularly understand. Ashley through a competitive gymnastics phase and then a theater phase before settling into the academic focus that took her to Northwestern. Brandon through baseball, and then a technology obsession, and then, of all things, a brief but passionate interest in competitive debate that his father found absolutely hilarious. They had opportunities Richard and I had never had. Ashley went to Northwestern on a partial merit scholarship. We covered the rest happily. and then completed an MBA at Indiana University. Brandon went to Ohio State, same as me, and graduated into a job at a financial consulting firm downtown where he was, by all accounts, good at what he did. We were proud of them. We were so proud of them that it was difficult sometimes to look at them without feeling a kind of overwhelming fullness. The specific pride of parents who have watched their children become capable adults, who have worked to give them a foundation and seen them build on it. I should have paid more attention to what they were building on it, and why, and for whom. I should have paid more attention to what they were building on it, and why, and for whom. The first sign came when Richard was diagnosed with early-stage heart disease in the spring of 2019. He was 66 years old, still working 5 days a week, still physically strong in the way that men who spent 30 years doing manual labor sometimes remain physically strong. There was a solidity to him, a density of presence, that had never entirely left him, even as his hair went silver and his pace slowed slightly, and he started wearing reading glasses he kept in 3 different rooms of the house because he could never remember where he'd put them. But the cardiologist was direct. Richard's left ventricle was showing reduced function. His coronary arteries had meaningful blockage, and the combination required serious management. Medication, dietary changes, stress reduction, and what the cardiologist called recalibrating your relationship with work. Richard had driven home from that appointment, come inside, stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at nothing, and then turned to me and said, "Well, I guess we need to have some conversations we've been putting off." We had those conversations. We talked about the business succession plan and the estate plan and what we wanted the next decade to look like and what mattered most to us and what we were willing to let go of. We talked about it the way we talked about everything, at the kitchen table, with coffee, with the directness of 2 people who had been married long enough to skip the parts that weren't necessary. We agreed that Richard would hand more day-to-day responsibility to his operations manager, a capable and loyal man named Tom Reardon, who had been with the company for 14 years. We agreed that I would take on a more active role in the property side of the business. We agreed that we would spend more time at the cabin. We also agreed to involve the children, to tell them about the health situation, to give them appropriate visibility into the family finances so that they weren't blindsided if something happened. That was Richard's idea, and it was generous. And I wonder sometimes what would have happened if we had made a different choice. I watched my children's faces during the family meeting we held at the house the weekend after Richard's diagnosis. I was watching for worry, for grief, for the kind of loving concern that the situation warranted. The concern I had felt myself, sitting in the cardiologist's office, listening to words like reduced function and lifestyle modification, and feeling the ground shift slightly beneath my sense of how the future was supposed to go. What I saw instead, just for a moment, just a flicker, gone so fast I told myself I had imagined it, was something that looked a great deal more like calculation than grief. Ashley asked about the business. Not, "Dad, are you okay?" Not, "What do you need from us?" She framed it carefully, wrapped in concern, but the question underneath the question was clear enough to anyone listening carefully. What happens to the company when you can't run it anymore? Who makes those decisions? How is it structured? Brandon asked about the properties. He had always been interested in the rental portfolio, not the work of managing it, which he had never shown any interest in helping with, but the financial architecture of it, the equity values, the appreciation curves, the net operating income. He asked Richard whether he had updated his will recently, whether their names were anywhere in the trust documents, whether there was anything they needed to know about how the estate would be handled. Richard, sitting in his favorite armchair with a cup of tea he had barely touched, smiled at both of them and said the portfolio was in good hands and that everything was taken care of, and that the most important thing right now was staying healthy so he could keep enjoying the business for another decade. He said it warmly and convincingly, the way he said most things, and Ashley and Brandon nodded and appeared satisfied. But I noticed, across the living room, the look that passed between them. Brief, practiced. The specific kind of look that passes between siblings who have had conversations their parents weren't present for. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself it for almost 2 years. Richard's health declined slowly but steadily through 2020 and into 2021. The pandemic year was hard on him. The restrictions, the isolation, the disruptions to the business that required constant management from home, the inability to be physically present at job sites the way he had always been. He lost weight he didn't need to lose. He napped in the afternoons, which he had never done before. He had a minor cardiac event in February of 2021, a moment of chest tightness and shortness of breath at his desk that sent us to the emergency room, where they monitored him overnight and eventually placed a stent. The procedure was routine and successful, and his cardiologist was satisfied. But the month of restricted activity that followed was the first time in our marriage that Richard seemed, to me, genuinely diminished. Not broken, not finished, but reduced in a way that was visible, that required adjustment. During that month, Ashley and her husband Derek came to stay at the house for 2 weeks. I was grateful for the company and the help, the extra hands, someone to take Brandon to pick up the prescriptions, someone to make dinner on the nights when I was too tired to think about it. But I noticed, during those 2 weeks, that Ashley had a great deal of private conversation with her father. Long conversations in the study with the door pulled most of the way closed. Not completely closed, which would have been more obviously deliberate, but pulled to a point where the contents were not audible from the hallway. Conversations that would end with a brisk subject change whenever I appeared in the doorway. Ashley showing Richard something on her laptop and then pivoting the screen slightly when I came in. Small things, each one explainable on its own, but accumulating in a way that created a low-grade, persistent unease I didn't know what to do with. I asked Richard about them once, directly, on a Sunday evening when Ashley and Derek had gone out for dinner, and we were alone in the kitchen. I asked what they had been talking about so much. He said Ashley was asking about the business, wanting to understand operations in case she needed to step in to help, wanting to build the knowledge base that would let her be useful if things got harder. He said it with a kind of careful neutrality that I recognized after 26 years of marriage as the voice he used when he was simplifying something, softening an edge, presenting a version of a thing that contained truth, but not the whole truth. I should have pressed. I let it go. He was recovering from a cardiac event, and I was not going to add to his stress over what felt, at the time, like a manageable unease that might resolve on its own. Brandon, meanwhile, had begun showing up at the property management office with a frequency that was new and slightly odd. He worked downtown, full schedule, ostensibly busy. But suddenly, he was at the office 2 afternoons a week, sitting with Tom Reardon, reviewing lease files, asking questions about the property valuations, chatting with the administrative staff in the casual, easy way of someone building relationships, rather than just gathering information. He told me he was learning the business, building the knowledge that would let him help if needed. Richard seemed genuinely pleased by the attention. I tried to be pleased too. What I did not know, during all of this, what I would not know until the Tuesday afternoon in October, when I came home early from Phil's office and stood in the hallway outside the study, was that both of my children had engaged an attorney several months earlier and had been meeting with him regularly. I did not know that the conversations in the study with the laptop had included discussions about Richard's estate documents. I did not know that Brandon's afternoons at the property office had included conversations with Tom Reardon that went well beyond learning the business. I did not know any of it. I only learned it all in pieces, afterward. But the piece that started everything was the one I heard standing in that hallway with the study door slightly open and the afternoon light coming through the window at the end of the hall, making a rectangle on the carpet that I stood just outside of, perfectly still, listening to my children and their lawyer discuss how to take everything I had spent 26 years building. I found out the full scope of it on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 2022, 10 days before Richard died. I had come home early from a meeting with our accountant, a man named Phil Garrett, who had handled our taxes for 15 years. The meeting had been routine, quarterly review, but Phil had said something near the end that had lodged in my mind like a splinter. He had mentioned, casually, that he had received a call from Brandon earlier in the week, asking about the tax implications of transferring property out of a joint trust before a death event. Phil had assumed Brandon was acting on Richard's behalf, and had answered the question technically, as he would for any client. He mentioned it to me in passing, not thinking anything was wrong. I had kept my face neutral through the rest of the meeting. I had driven home on autopilot. I had walked in through the back door, into the kitchen, and I had heard voices from Richard's study, Ashley's voice, and Brandon's voice, and the lower, deliberate voice of a man I didn't recognize. The study door was slightly open. I stood in the hallway and I listened. "The joint tenancy is the problem," the unknown voice was saying. He had the clipped, confident diction of a lawyer. "As long as the property is held in joint tenancy with right of survivorship, she takes everything automatically on his death. That's just how it works. If you want to change that outcome, the instrument has to be retitled before death, into a trust, or into his name alone." "And he can sign that?" Brandon's voice, low and urgent. "He's still mentally competent?" "He was as of last month's evaluation. You'd want to move quickly." "What about her?" Ashley's voice, cold. I had never heard my daughter's voice that cold. "She's going to notice. She won't have standing to contest it if he signs voluntarily and with competence. She might try, but it would be expensive and the odds are not in her favor." A pause. Then Ashley again. "And the business?" "The business is structured differently. That one's cleaner. The operating agreement already has transfer provisions. The key is making sure she's not listed as a successor manager." I don't know how long I stood in that hallway. Long enough that my back began to ache from standing perfectly still. Long enough for my mind to run through every conversation of the past 3 years, every closed door, and exchanged look and question framed too carefully, and rearrange them into the picture I had been refusing to see. My children were trying to cut me out of everything Richard and I had built together. They were doing it while he was dying. They were doing it with lawyers and legal instruments and careful timing. They were doing it as if I were a stranger, as if the 26 years I had spent building this life alongside their father counted for nothing. As if I were an obstacle to be managed, not a person to be considered. I walked back out the back door. I sat in my car in the driveway for 45 minutes. And then I picked up my phone and called the one person I knew I could trust completely, Richard's mother, Gloria. Gloria Calloway was 81 years old and sharp as a tack, and she had, I would come to learn, been watching the same things I had been watching for longer than I had. She listened to everything I told her without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Brittany," she said at last, "Richard needs to know about this. Tonight." "He's sick, Gloria." He's not gone yet," she said firmly, "and he needs to know what his children are doing in his house with his lawyer while he's still breathing. You call me back after you talk to him." I went back inside. The lawyer was gone. Ashley and Brandon were in the kitchen, and they looked up when I came in with expressions of such practiced normalcy that I felt a wave of nausea. I told them I needed to rest. I went upstairs. I waited until I heard them settle in the living room below before I slipped into the bedroom where Richard was resting. He was awake. He was almost always awake now, the heart medication making true sleep elusive. He looked at my face and he said, without preamble, "You heard them." I sat down on the edge of the bed. "You knew?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the October wind moved through the oak trees in the backyard, the same trees he had planted when Brandon was a toddler. "I've known something was coming," he said slowly. "I didn't know how far they'd gone." He looked at the ceiling. "I want you to open the drawer, the nightstand. Take out the Bible. I reached for it, the old King James version his mother had given him when he was confirmed, brown leather worn soft and thin at the corners. When I opened it, a white business envelope fell out from somewhere near the back. My name was written on the front in Richard's careful handwriting. I had Howard Bates draw it up 14 months ago, Richard said. Howard Bates was our estate attorney, not the same man I had heard in the study, someone else, someone who had been Richard's attorney since the early 2000s. I didn't tell you because I hoped I wouldn't need it. I hoped I was wrong about them. His voice dropped. I wasn't wrong. Inside the envelope was a document, a post-nuptial agreement, formally executed and witnessed and notarized, along with a revised trust instrument and a letter of instruction that Howard Bates had prepared. The post-nuptial agreement confirmed, in language that was not ambiguous, that all marital assets, the house, the rental properties, the business, every account, were jointly held, and that in the event of Richard's death, 100% passed to me outright. The revised trust had been signed 14 months ago. It named me as sole trustee and sole beneficiary of the living trust into which all major assets had been transferred. There was also a letter, a handwritten letter from Richard to me, folded separately, that I did not read until after he was gone. I could not have read it in that moment. I would not have been able to see the words through what was happening in my chest. The signed originals are with Howard, Richard told me. He has instructions. But I want you to keep a certified copy, in case anyone tries to say there's been a mistake. I held the envelope and I looked at my husband, the man I had stood next to for 26 years, the man who had built everything with me and who had, in the quiet of the past 14 months, prepared for the possibility of his own children's betrayal with the same careful competence with which he had always handled everything. "Richard," I whispered. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry they turned out this way. I don't know where we went wrong." "We didn't go wrong," I said, and I meant it, even then. He died 11 days later, early on a Thursday morning, peacefully in our bedroom, with me holding his hand. It was the 27th of October, 2022. The days between that conversation and his death had a strange, suspended quality. I went through the motions of each day with a kind of focused calm that surprised even me. I called Howard Bates the morning after Richard showed me the envelope. Howard confirmed everything and told me that he had already filed the necessary documents with the county recorder's office and that the trust was fully in order. He used the word bulletproof twice. He told me I had nothing to fear legally, that what Ashley and Brandon and their lawyer had been planning could not be executed, that Richard had closed every door they had been trying to open. I thanked him. I asked him to keep everything confidential until after Richard passed. He agreed. I told no one else. Not my sister Carol in Cincinnati, not my closest friend Marcy, not Gloria. Even Gloria, who had started everything by telling me to speak to Richard, did not know what had been found or what had been prepared. I needed to know that nothing would leak. I needed Ashley and Brandon to believe they had succeeded. I needed them to walk through the next days, thinking that the plan they had set in motion was still in place. Because what I had realized, sitting in that bedroom with my dying husband and the envelope in my hands, was that there were two ways I could handle what was coming. I could reveal what I knew and confront my children before Richard died, which would create conflict and legal drama at the worst possible moment and give them time to strategize and regroup. Or I could let them believe they had won. I could let them feel the satisfaction of their plan. I could let them make their move, completely, openly, without restraint. And then I could respond. The second option appealed to me in a way I was not entirely comfortable with. But I had lived 62 years, and I understood at this point that the most complete form of justice was the kind that did not give the other side time to prepare. So I prepared instead. I moved the certified copy of the trust documents and the post-nuptial agreement into my carry-on suitcase. I moved Richard's handwritten letter there too, though that one I kept for myself, for reasons that had nothing to do with legal strategy. I memorized Howard Bates's phone number. I noted, carefully, which of our accounts I had independent access to, and which required dual authorization, and I made sure the relevant paperwork was in order before the funeral. I went through the funeral planning with Ashley and Brandon as if everything were normal. I watched them manage the logistics with the efficient confidence of people who believe they are handling what will shortly be theirs. I watched Derek, Ashley's husband, take phone calls outside the funeral home that I was certain were with their lawyer. I watched Brandon's wife Tiffany survey the house, our house, mine and Richard's, with an appraising eye, her gaze moving over the furniture and the art on the walls in a way that made me think she had already been picturing where her own things would go. I kept my face a careful blank. I smiled when I needed to smile. I accepted condolences. I held the hands of people who had known Richard for 40 years and told them he had been a good man because he had been, because that was true, regardless of what was happening around it. The funeral was on a Saturday, the 5th of November, in the same church where we had been married in 1996, where Ashley and Brandon had been baptized. The pastor spoke about the work of Richard's hands and the legacy of a life built with integrity. I sat in the front pew between my two children and I thought, with a calmness that should probably have frightened me, you have no idea what is about to happen. After the burial, after the last handful of earth, after everyone had drifted to the parking lot, and then to the reception that Ashley had organized at the house, I went back to the grave. I stood there in the cold and I said my real goodbye, the private one, the one that was mine alone. I told Richard that I had heard him. I told him I understood what he had done and why. I told him that I would handle it. When I arrived home 40 minutes later, my suitcases were on the front walkway, not on the porch, on the walkway, past the porch steps, practically at the edge of the driveway, as if they had been placed there with the specific intention that anyone driving past could see them. The black, roll-along bag I kept in the closet for conferences. The soft-sided carry-on that I had deliberately loaded and brought with me to the funeral. My overnight bag. All three, lined up neatly on the cold concrete. Ashley and Brandon were standing on the porch. Derek was behind them, slightly to the right, with his arms crossed. Tiffany was in the doorway, holding a glass of wine, my wine from my kitchen, and watching with the expression of someone watching a reality television show they have been anticipating. The door was locked. I could see it from the driveway. The deadbolt was thrown. They had locked me out of my own home while I was still at the cemetery, saying goodbye to my husband. I stood for a moment and looked at them, all four of them. My daughter, who had Northwestern degrees and a sharp mind I had once been so proud of. My son, who had Richard's eyes and his grandfather's stubborn jaw. Their spouses, who had apparently been fully briefed and fully on board. 4 adults standing on the porch of a house that had been in my name for 26 years, telling me, with their presence and their locked door and my luggage on the walkway, that I was being removed. "Mom," Ashley said. Her voice was steady, performatively kind, the tone of someone who has rehearsed this speech. "We know this is hard, but we've been talking, and we need to make some decisions about the estate. While those decisions are being made, it would be better for everyone if you had some space." "This is no longer your place," Brandon said. He was less careful than Ashley. His voice had an edge of something that might have been guilt trying to present itself as resolve. "You should go. We'll let you know when we've sorted things out." "You'll be more comfortable somewhere else while we get everything organized," Ashley added. "There's a Hampton Inn on Henderson Road. We can cover the cost for a few nights." A Hampton Inn. They were offering to put me in a Hampton Inn while they took possession of my home. I looked at my daughter's face. I looked at my son's face. I thought about the 26 years I had worked alongside their father. I thought about the school events I had never missed and the college tuitions we had paid in full, and the Sunday dinners, and the Christmas mornings, and the 1,000 ordinary moments that make up a life shared with children you love without condition. I thought about Richard lying in a grave 2 miles away, in the earth I had just come from. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. I had expected to cry. I had half expected to fall apart, to beg, to say all the things a woman who had just buried her husband might be expected to say when her children throw her out of her home on the same day. But the cold, quiet thing that had settled into my chest over the past 14 days held firm. I felt no impulse to rage or collapse. I felt, if anything, a sense of enormous clarity. I walked across the driveway to where my suitcases were sitting. I picked up the handles of the roll-along and the carry-on. I looked back at the porch one more time. Brandon had shifted slightly, as if he wasn't sure whether he should say something else. Ashley was holding her chin up, resolute, already somewhere in her head past this moment and into what came next. Derek looked satisfied. Tiffany sipped her wine. "Okay," I said. "Just that. One word." I put my bags in the trunk of the Lexus, and I got in and I drove away. In the rearview mirror, I could see them watching. I could not see their expressions clearly, but I could imagine them. The relief, the self-congratulation, the sense that the hardest part was over. They thought they had won. I drove to Howard Bates's office. He had told me to come there directly if I needed to. He had half expected something like this, had told me, in fact, that the days immediately following Richard's death were the most likely time for a move. His office was a quiet suite on the 17th floor of a building downtown, all dark wood and bookshelves, and the particular stillness of a place where serious things are handled carefully. Howard was waiting for me. He poured me a glass of water and sat down across from me and said, "Tell me what happened." I told him. He listened without expression until I finished. Then he nodded once, slowly, and picked up his phone. "I'm going to call the county recorder's office first," he said. "Then we're going to contact the bank, and then I'm going to make a call to your children's attorney." He looked at me over his reading glasses. "The trust has been recorded for 14 months, Brittany. Every asset is in it. There is nothing for them to contest. What they did today is not just futile. It may actually constitute a form of wrongful exclusion that has its own remedies." "I want to go home," I said. My voice was still calm, but something underneath it was beginning to shake loose, just slightly. The first sign that the coldness would not hold forever, that at some point I would have to feel all of this. "You will," Howard said. "Give me 24 hours. It took 36. Howard's first call was to their attorney, a man named Craig something, from a firm I had never heard of, which told me my children had been careful to find someone outside our usual professional circles. Howard introduced himself and explained, pleasantly and thoroughly, that Richard Calloway's estate had been fully disposed of via a revocable living trust executed 14 months prior, that all assets were held in the trust, that the trust named Brittany Calloway as sole trustee and sole beneficiary, and that the trust had been recorded with the Franklin County Recorder's Office since September of the prior year. He gave the recording number. He offered to forward the documents. There was a silence on the other end of the line that Howard later described to me as educational. The bank calls were straightforward. The accounts were titled to the trust, and I was the trustee, so nothing had moved and nothing could move without my signature. The house was the same, recorded in the trust, my name as trustee, no secondary signatures required. The rental properties, all 11 of them across Franklin and Hamilton counties, were in the trust. The business operating agreement named me as successor manager, a provision Richard had updated quietly 18 months ago. There was nothing for my children to take. There had never been anything. Richard had closed every door, months before any of this began. Howard sent the documents to Craig the attorney by certified email at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, 40 hours after I had driven away from my house with my suitcases. He called me immediately afterward and told me to check my phone. Ashley had texted me at 9:43 that same morning. The text said, "Mom, Craig says we need to talk. Can you call me?" There was no apology in the text. There was no acknowledgement of what had happened. There was only the language of someone who has just been informed that their plan has failed and needs to manage the situation. I did not respond to Ashley's text. I did not respond to Brandon's call, which came at 10:15 and which I let go to voicemail. I did not respond to Derek's text, which came in the afternoon and which was so carefully worded as to be almost artistically evasive about what had actually happened. I responded to none of them for 4 days. I stayed at Donna's house, Richard's sister, my sister-in-law, who had tried to stay with me at the cemetery, and who cried when I showed up at her door, and who put me in her guest room and fed me soup and let me be quiet for as long as I needed to be quiet. On the second morning, I finally opened Richard's letter. The handwritten one, the personal one, the one that had nothing to do with legal strategy. It took me 3 tries to read it all the way through. He wrote about the early years, about the firm in Columbus, and the terrible coffee in the conference room where we had first met. He wrote about the night I had stayed up with him until 2 a.m. going over the business plan for the construction division, spread out on our kitchen table with takeout containers pushed to the side, and how he had looked up and seen me in the lamplight and thought, "That woman is the reason any of this works." He wrote about watching me with our children when they were small, before everything calcified into what it became, and how the greatest regret of his life was that he could not figure out how to give them the values we had tried to give them without their figuring out how to use them as tools. He wrote, "I know what they are planning. I knew before you did, or I knew sooner. A man knows his children's natures in a way he sometimes wishes he didn't. I am sorry that I am leaving you to handle it. I would have given anything to handle it myself. What I can do, the only thing left, is make sure that when it comes, you are not standing alone in it. You have never needed protecting. But I wanted to make sure anyway." I read that paragraph 6 times. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope, and I sat in Donna's guest room with the November light coming through the curtains, and I finally cried. Not for what my children had done, not for the suitcases on the driveway, or the locked door, or the Hampton Inn. I cried for the man who had known and prepared and written me a letter and died anyway, the way we all do, with things unfinished and love left over. I gave myself that afternoon, just that one afternoon. On Thursday morning, 4 days after the funeral, I called Howard and told him I was ready to go home. He had already been in contact with my children's attorney twice more, and the picture that had emerged was complete and not particularly surprising. Ashley and Brandon had been operating on the assumption, fed to them by their lawyer, that Richard's estate was primarily governed by a will that had been drafted in 2015, before the trust was created. This was partly their lawyer's error. He had not done thorough enough due diligence on the asset structure, and partly the result of their own wishful thinking. They had seen a version of the estate plan that Richard had shown them years ago and had not known about the updates. The trust had been the update, a quiet, thorough legal update that had taken place 14 months ago, with no announcement. When I arrived at the house on Thursday afternoon, Howard was with me. Ashley's car was in the driveway. Brandon's was on the street. They had apparently been staying at the house, my house, and had, to their credit, not damaged anything or removed anything, possibly because their lawyer had told them not to once he understood the scope of what they were dealing with. Ashley opened the door before I reached the porch. She looked, for the first time in months, like my daughter. Not the controlled, strategic presence she had become, but a 34-year-old woman who had done something terrible and was beginning to understand it fully. There were shadows under her eyes. Her posture was different. Something in her had collapsed slightly. "Mom," she said. "Step aside, please," I said quietly. She stepped aside. Brandon was in the living room. He stood up when I came in, and I could see in his face the same quality I had seen in Ashley's. The particular shame of someone who has been caught, not just doing a wrong thing, but being a wrong thing, and who doesn't yet have the language to address it. He started to say something. "Not yet," I said. "Howard and I need to do a walkthrough first." We did a thorough walkthrough. Nothing had been taken. The house was clean. Tiffany had apparently done some cleaning while they were there, which was something. When Howard and I had confirmed that everything was in order, he excused himself and left me alone with my children. The conversation that followed was one of the longest and most difficult of my life, and I am going to tell you honestly that I did not handle it perfectly. I am 62 years old, and my husband had been in the ground for 6 days, and I was sitting across from the 2 people I had brought into the world. And what I felt was not simple. It was grief and fury, and love and exhaustion, and something approaching pity, all happening at the same time, impossible to separate. I told them what I knew. I told them about standing in the hallway and hearing the lawyer. I told them I knew how long it had been going on, that I had seen the signs much earlier and had chosen to ignore them, and that was my failure as much as theirs. I told them what Richard had done, not in detail, not with the letter, that was mine, but enough. I told them that their father had known, that he had spent the last year of his life quietly protecting me from his own children, and that I wanted them to sit with that fact for as long as it took to understand it. Ashley cried. Brandon did not. He sat with his hands on his knees and his jaw tight and looked at the floor, which was, I understood, its own kind of breaking. I did not forgive them that day. I want to be clear about that too. Forgiveness is not the same as resolution, and resolution was what that day required. I told them that I was not going to pursue legal action against them. Howard had mentioned that the wrongful exclusion had remedies, but I had no interest in turning this into a lawsuit. I had what was mine. I was home. That was enough. I told them that what happened next between us was entirely up to them, and that I would not be the one to make it easy. I told them that their father had deserved children who were better than what they had shown themselves to be, and that if there was any part of them that understood that, they would spend however long it took proving it with their actions rather than their words. Brandon looked up when I said that, just once, and for a moment I saw his father in him, the jaw, the eyes, something in the set of his shoulders, and it cost me more than I let it show. They left that afternoon. I do not know exactly what conversations they had with Derek and Tiffany after that, or with their lawyer. I know that Craig, whoever he was, submitted a formal withdrawal from the matter within the week, which Howard mentioned with a dry satisfaction that told me he had communicated something pointed in their final exchange. I know that Brandon's office calls me less frequently now to discuss the rental portfolio, and that the calls he does make are professional and careful in a way that is not the same as the easy confidence he used to bring to them. I know that Ashley sent me a text 3 weeks later that said, "I need you to know I'm sorry," and nothing else, and that I read it several times before I put my phone down without responding, not because I didn't feel anything, but because I was not ready and I was not going to pretend otherwise. That was 4 months ago. I am still in the house. My house. Our house. Richard's trees are bare now, the oaks in the backyard stripped down to their winter architecture, and on the days when the light comes through at a low angle in the late afternoon, the shadows they cast across the yard are long and exact and beautiful in the way that only bare trees in winter can be. I have been learning in these months to inhabit the house as myself alone, to eat dinner at whatever hour I want, to leave lights on or off according to my own preferences, to move through the rooms without managing anyone else's needs or expectations. It is lonely. I will not pretend it isn't. 26 years of a shared life leaves a shape in the air, and no legal document fills it. But I am here. I am solvent. I am intact. And I have, in these months, come to understand something about the document in my suitcase that is not entirely about legal protection. When Richard tucked that envelope in his Bible, in the nightstand drawer, in the room where we had slept together for 26 years, he wasn't just protecting my assets. He was telling me something. He was saying, I saw you. I saw what you did and what you gave and what it was worth. Even at the end, even when he was preparing for his own death, his primary concern was making sure I knew that. That is not a small thing. That is not something that can be contested or retitled or transferred to someone else. That is mine. Gloria calls me every Sunday. She called me the Sunday after I moved back in and said, I told you so, and then laughed in a way that made me laugh too, for the first time since October. She is 81 years old, and she is one of the sharpest and most loving people I have ever known, and she has not spoken to her grandchildren since the funeral. That is her choice, and I have not asked her to make a different one. Some ruptures require time. Some require more than time. I don't know yet which kind this is. I am managing the business. I am managing it well, I think. Phil from accounting called last month and said the Q3 numbers were the strongest in 3 years, which Richard would have been pleased about, although he also would have pointed out that the maintenance costs on the Henderson Road properties were creeping up and that something needed to be done about the roof on the Cincinnati building before spring. He was always right about things like that. I have put the Henderson Road roof on the schedule for February. I have started going back to the cemetery on Sunday afternoons, after Gloria's call. I bring coffee, 1 cup for me, and I sit on the bench near Richard's plot, and I tell him what's been happening, the way you do when someone is gone, and the habit of talking to them is too strong to break, even when you know, rationally, that talking to a grave is a conversation with yourself. I tell him about the business. I tell him about the house. I tell him about Ashley's text and Brandon's careful phone calls and Gloria's laugh on Sunday mornings. I tell him that I am figuring it out. Last Sunday, I told him about the document. I told him I had moved it out of the suitcase finally. It had been in there for 4 months, in the zippered inner pocket, like a talisman, and I had put it in the file cabinet in the study, in the folder labeled Trust Documents, where it belongs now that it has served its purpose. I told him that the suitcase was back in the closet, empty and ordinary, the way suitcases are when they're not carrying anything important. And then I told him thank you. For the document, yes, but more for the letter, more for seeing me, more for being, all the way to the end, the man who understood that the most important thing was not the assets or the properties or the carefully structured legal instruments, but the person on the other side of all of it, the woman who had sat across from him at a conference table in 1994 with spreadsheets between them, and later built a life with him that was worth protecting. I am still building it, just differently now, just alone, but with everything that's mine. If you made it to the end of this story, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted them sooner or waited like I did? Would you have forgiven them? I genuinely want to know. And if this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, or if you've ever been protected by someone who loved you quietly and completely, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you're not already here, because there are more stories like this one, and every single one of them is about the same thing. What happens when people mistake patience for weakness and find out, too late, that they were wrong? I'll see you in the next one.